From sprint to Ironman, nutrition planning for triathletes of all levels. Learning objectives for this course. Upon completion, learners will be able to design a personalized nutrition plan for a triathlete, including carb, protein, and fat intake recommendations, as well as fluid intake strategies. They'll also be able to identify and explain the importance of key nutritional periods for triathletes, including pre-training, during training, post-training, and competition-specific nutrition. They'll also be able to analyze common nutritional challenges faced by triathletes, such as gastrointestinal distress, dehydration, and electrolyte imbalances, and also provide evidence-based solutions. Lastly but not least, they'll also be able to evaluate the role of supplements and ergogenic aids, including their potential benefits and risks, and provide guidance on safe and effective use. Module 1, it's touching over energy systems and macronutrient needs. Our body mainly is going to be using these three energy systems, starting off with the ATP PCR system, also known as the phosphagen system, is used strictly for short bursts of energy. This energy system utilizes creatine phosphate, which the body does not contain much of. So it's going to be limited by that concentration of fuel. So this is going to be short bursts of energy. After that, moving into the anaerobic, meaning without oxygen system, also known as the glycolytic system. The body uses glycolysis to break down glucose to use as fuel. This energy system is typically limited by one's lactate threshold. Most specifically, we're looking at glucose stored in the muscle, which is why it's meaning without oxygen. And that lactate threshold is going to be the limiting factor for this energy system. But also, once you run out of that muscle glucose, beyond that is when we get closer to the oxidative and aerobic system. This is going to be the most complex of the three, using multiple sources for fuel, and involves the use of oxygen in the creation of this fuel. It's going to be breaking down glycogen coming from the liver as well as the muscle. It's also going to be using fat as a fuel source and glucose for extended bouts of exercise. So this is already going to be beyond that lactate threshold, beyond that phosphagen system. This is anywhere north of 3 minutes, and this is what we're mostly going to see when it comes to this endurance racing. Primarily, it's going to be used during lower intensity bouts compared to previous energy systems, just because lower intensity bouts of exercise generally need a long duration in order to cause a stimulus for adaptation looking for in training. Some examples of the triathlon distances are going to be sprint all the way up to full Ironman. Here you could see the specific breakdown per distance. But in general, you'll see at minimum, we're going to be looking at an hour unless you're an extremely elite sprint triathlete. Um, Outside of that, pretty much every other person, every other triathlete is well beyond an hour, given depending on the distance and skill level. So we're going to be looking almost exclusively at the oxidative system for the most part, outside of short instances as passing a competitor on a straight or switching from transition one from swimming to biking. So changing your gear, getting the wetsuit off, getting your cycle shoes on, and that quick turnover will be instances where you may see some other energy systems kick in beyond above and beyond. Macronutrient needs specific for triathletes. This is based on Marquette et al. 2016. In a study published in Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise, dietary periodization was shown to cause improvements in performance for endurance athletes. But most specifically in the study that was interesting to note was it prescribed a specific diet to each triathlete based on body mass. Uh, this diet consisted of 1.6 grams per kilogram, give or take, for protein intake, 5.5 grams per kilogram for carbohydrate intake, and 1 gram per kilogram for fat intake. This prescribed diet also falls within the general recommendations by the ISSN for endurance-based athletes. This also depends on the intensity of exercise, specifically for carbohydrates. Looking at 5 to 7 grams per kilogram for moderate intensity, but as high as 8 to 12 grams per kilogram for high intensity exercise, in the carbohydrate recommended intake by the ISSN. For protein, we're looking at 1.4 grams per kilogram up to 2 grams per kilogram. And the only recommendation given around fat intake is just not to restrict intake below 20% of total caloric intake. Outside of that, this is one of the only studies that really dictates and prescribes a specific gram per kilogram fat intake for its athletes. Here we can also see an example of what the top end of calories burned during a exercise bout would be. So we could see as high as 12,000 calories being burned across a full Ironman, but in training alone, we're seeing thousands of calories burned. The predominant energy system used is going to be the oxidative system, outside of those small instances where we see the other energy systems kick in for some short bouts. Another note to take in regards to the glycogen storage in the body, all of it put together between the liver and the muscle uh, can only really provide about 2,500 calories worth of energy before being fully depleted. And this is why carbohydrate supplementation pre and during race or training is going to be crucial, not only for performance, but also just to go the distance. Module two is going to be looking at that optimized carbohydrate intake. Carb loading specifically is going to depend on duration. So anything below 90 minutes, which in this case it really is only going to touch on pretty well trained sprint distance triathletes. Really, the only recommendation is going to be to top off. This will vary per athlete based on what they're already used to in their carb intake, but at least 6 grams per kilogram. But it can be as high as 12 grams per kilogram, depending on what the athlete is already used to intaking, strictly in the 24 hours leading up to the event. When we see closer to the 90 plus minute bouts of exercise, which is going to be essentially any other distance of triathlon, that's when you start seeing 3 day protocols, even 36 to 48 hour protocols being recommended. And that is going to be closer to that 10 to 12 grams per kilogram intake that's going to be prescribed for those protocols. However, when it comes to the morning of, goes across the board in general, in the 1 to 4 hour leading up to the event, you want to see about 1 to 4 grams per kilogram intake for the carbohydrates just to top off. Reason being, most of these races are going to be occurring early in the morning, and these athletes are going to be waking up very, very early. So they're going to go to sleep very early, and overnight, you're going to naturally be in a fasted state, and your BMR is still chugging along. So fuel is being used, albeit at a low rate overnight, but still being used. So simply just topping off those stores with breakfast is going to be beneficial pre-race. Some considerations to take into place is going to be GI distress. This is going to be one of the main limiting factors when we see that range of 6 to 12 grams per kilogram. It comes down to how well trained the athlete's gut is and how accustomed they are to high carbohydrate diets. Avoiding high fiber intake is also going to be a best avenue, specifically in that carb loading as well, to avoid any stomach distress and kind of regulate the bowel movement. And also, not noted here, but to prevent satiation. Higher fiber intake is going to be more satiating, which is going to prevent you being able to take in more carbohydrates. Same thing goes with protein and fats. Fats are going to have more calories per gram, and protein itself is satiating more so than the other two macronutrients. So limiting all those three is going to help accommodate for that increased carbohydrate intake. And again, the gut is able to be trained. So especially during that training program, you want to experiment and introduce carbohydrate intake around training, high carbohydrate days, low carbohydrate days, and help include carbohydrate during your workouts to help train the gut. Module three, pre, during, and post exercise fueling strategies. Again, morning of, you want to include depending on how close you get to the actual bout of exercise, you do want to taper off. So if it's just 1 hour away, you want to be closer to that 1 gram per kilogram, just because you want the also blood flow in the body to be concentrated on your muscles as opposed to your stomach for the purpose of digestion. And then the same thing goes for fiber intake, fat and protein, limiting that prior to the race so you can promote rapid gastric emptying and really ease the job of your gastric system and make it as simple and light as possible. Hydrating really only needs to come ad libitum. So if you're thirsty, drink up. If not, you're all good. Pre-race hydration really is only important when it comes specifically to electrolyte balance and salt loading. This may be a limiting factor when it comes to muscle cramping induced by exercise. So just to reduce the likelihood of that, salt loading would be beneficial. Outside of that, general hydration, as long as you're not thirsty, you should be good. During exercise, it's going to also vary on duration. Anything less than 60 minutes, carbohydrate intake, it really isn't necessary. Mouth rinsing may be beneficial, but again, that comes more so on an individual basis per athlete. Again, fluid intake, completely ad libitum. If you're thirsty, drink. If not, just chug along. Um, Unless you are reaching closer to that 60-minute mark and you're in extremely hot and humid climate, you do want to prevent excessive weight loss, anything above 3% body weight difference. In that 60 minutes to 2.5 hour is generally when we start seeing that 30 to 60 grams per hour, which is generally recommended for most endurance exercise. Limiting factor there is just going to be personal oxidation rates. Usually we see about 1 gram per minute, but also GI distress, whether the gut is trained or not to even have 60 grams per hour. Some athletes that may have not been training with carbohydrates during their training mesocycle may only be able to achieve about 30 grams per hour. Sodium intake, we want to see about 500 milligrams per hour. Uh, North of that, if it is hot and humid. And same thing with fluid intake, honestly, across the board, just preventing anything above a 3% total weight loss. 2.5 hours plus, this is where we start seeing some pretty astronomical carbohydrate intake in some specific athletes. North of 90 grams per hour have been noted before. But recommendations can start to hit between 60 to 80, up to even 90 grams per hour when you start really going beyond that 3 hour threshold. Again, limitations going to be individual oxidation rates and gastric tolerance. And at this rate, it's really going to require multiple forms of delivery. So that's liquids with drink mixes, semi-solids with gels, and solids. At this level, personalized sodium intake and fluid intake is going to be highly recommended. Every athlete sweats a different amount, and their sweat is going to have different levels of content. So, really taking a look at that and making sure those are treated. Considerations, specifically for triathlons, most of this intake is going to be during the cycling portion. You can't drink or eat anything while you're swimming. And the running portion, generally, you're going to be bringing it home at that rate, and you're not really going to be fueling for any upcoming bouts at that rate. So, cycling is going to be the primary intake period, and that's going to be for the purpose of replenishing stores from the run, gearing up for the rest of the cycle, and for the upcoming run. Um, Specific intakes have been found to be anywhere from a gram to 1.1 grams per kilogram per hour, but specifically during cycling, we've seen around 1.5 grams per kilogram, which is going to be closer to that 90 grams per hour. Carbohydrate intake has been positively correlated with finish time, so if you can do more, it's going to be recommended to intake as much as possible up to that upper limit. Module 4, recovery, nutrition, and guidelines. So immediately post exercise, we want to replenish those glucose and glycogen stores. So about a gram to 1.2 grams per kilogram in that first hour. But also in general, we want about 8 grams to 10 grams per kilogram in that first day. Fluid loss is going to be crucial to replace. So about 150% of that fluid loss, you want to intake that. 20 to 40 grams of protein is going to be recommended to help prevent muscle loss. Like we touched upon earlier, when you really start looking at what these recommendations are to take intake during the race, at most for a full Ironman, you're taking maybe 3,500 calories. Um, but you're burning well beyond that. So this energy deficit being created, your body's going to be pulling from its glycogen stores. It's going to be pulling from fat stores, and it's also, to a certain extent, depending on the individual, of course, going to be pulling from muscle that's not being utilized. This is why you'll see, generally speaking, some triathletes are going to have a very slim arms or upper body and shoulders, but very muscular legs and lower body. So to help prevent any muscle loss and stimulate MPS, muscle protein synthesis, as much as possible, is going to be intaking 20 to 40 grams of protein within that first hour as well. And coming back up to that 1.4 to 2 grams per kilogram in that day post exercise. Same recommendation for fat intake, just don't go below that 20% threshold. And this is going to be all those recommendations summarized all together. Module 5, evidence-based ergogenic aids. For endurance athletes specifically, we're going to be looking mostly at creatine monohydrate and caffeine. For creatine monohydrate, generally 5 grams seems to be the recommendation. But some studies even show 0.1 grams per kilogram to be a better prescription. In my case, I would be 6.5 grams on a daily basis for muscle strength and endurance. Caffeine, 3 milligrams up to 6 milligrams per kilogram about an hour before exercise to improve time to exhaustion. Again, this will vary if somebody's caffeine adapted or not. If somebody's not very caffeine adapted, lower end may do all that they really need it to do. And if they are caffeine adapted, maybe 6 as much as 9 milligrams per kilogram may be necessary. Nitrates, jury tends to be out on that. However, there have been specific studies here and there that have shown some beneficial use. So being that the athlete is going to be carb loading for the most part prior to the race, nitrate rich whole foods also tend to be carb based. So it wouldn't be a bad idea to increase intake of those nitrate rich whole foods 3 to 6 days pre-race. And this will be to help lower the VO2 requirement in sub-maximum workloads, which essentially just means utilizing less oxygen to generate that energy in that endurance bout. Creatine monohydrate's main benefits are found to be in muscle strength and not specifically endurance. However, resistance training plays such an integral part in triathlete training in general that simply improving muscle strength is going to carry over into general performance in race day. Caffeine was also found to provide benefits when taken during the race. So even 1 milligram per kilogram every 2 hours to help prevent like the onset of fatigue, or simply even just taking 2 to 3 milligrams per kilogram in one shot around the onset of fatigue will help reduce that rating of perceived exertion. Whole foods rich in nitrates include beetroot juice, celery, spinach, lettuce, cress, and any other similar leafy greens. So these will be good foods to look into during the carb loading phase.